Welcome to the Going Zero Sustainability Podcast. Each week, Christy Cook, Seth Combs, and Eric Passawak help business leaders navigate the sustainability maze in the workplace. Going Zero is sponsored by Emerald Ecovations, creating sustainable solutions for everyday essentials at your place of work. From coffee cups and paper towels to food service containers and more. Emerald Ecovations is leading the charge in tree-free, plastic-free, compostable solution. Visit emeraldecovations.com.
Hey everyone, we are back with another episode of Going Zero, and I am joined by my co-hosts Christy Cook and Eric Passawak. And this is the podcast where we dive deep into the world of sustainability, ESG, and all things green. Today we're diving into the world of the circular economy. Unlike the traditional take, make, waste model, the circular economy aims to keep products, materials, and resources in use for as long as possible. It's all about rethinking how we produce, consume, and dispose of items, transforming waste into new opportunities, from fashion to electronics, and even food packaging. The shift to circularity is gaining momentum. Let's explore what this means in practice and how businesses are leading the way. Eric, can you kick us off by defining the circular economy and explaining how it differs from traditional, linear models of production?
Thanks, Seth. Sure. Let me kick us off here. The circular economy is an economic model designed to minimize waste and make the most of resources by rethinking how products and materials are designed, used, and eventually reintegrated into the economy. And that's an important distinction, reintegrating them into the economy versus recycling or disposing in a way. Unlike traditional linear models of as you mentioned, the take, make, waste model, a circular economy aims to create a regenerative system. And you're going to hear this word regenerative throughout today's podcast, where resources are kept in use for as long as possible, extracting maximum value before recovering and regenerating products and materials at the end of their life cycle. This approach is based on three core principles. First is eliminating waste and pollution. Designing products for durability, reuse, and ability to be repaired or remanufactured, companies can prevent waste from being created in the first place. This is an element of durability. This is an element of material selection in the production of your products. There's a lot of different elements that go into trying to eliminate waste and pollution in the manufacturing or services sector. Second, circulate products and materials. This involves keeping materials in use, either as a product or when no longer usable as raw materials for new products. It encourages activities like sharing, refurbishing, and recycling. Third, regenerate natural systems. The circular model also emphasizes returning nutrients to ecosystems and focusing on practices that restore the environment, such as composting and sustainable agriculture. One way to look at this model is as a mimicry of natural ecosystems and cycles. In natural systems, such as the water cycle, water changes its state and serves different purposes throughout its life cycle. But it is self-regenerative and it's sustainable. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation highlights the potential economic benefits of this shift, including substantial savings in material costs, up to $700 billion globally in consumer goods. Transitioning to a circular economy could also help halve carbon emissions in sectors like mobility and food systems by 2030. Christy, you want to join the conversation?
I do. I just think it's huge because I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up, there used to be a ton of TV repair stores, right? We don't repair our TVs anymore because it's cheaper to go buy a new one. And the technology changes and you're like, oh, well, I can get a better TV and it's cheaper. And there's so many examples like that. And so this idea of circularity, I think, is huge and not wasting, And so I always think of that, but I tell you what, it always gets me too with kitchen appliances. I don't know about you guys, but some little gasket will break or something, and then you buy a whole new thing. It's so annoying.
Yeah,
So I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, it's a huge paradigm shift overall, I think, and is going against the flow of the economic model currently, which is, like you said, to produce things as cheaply as possible and to have them be replaced instead of fixed in their life cycles. So it's hard. I've had a couple of different examples. One, successfully changing a circuit in my washing machine, which allowed me to preserve it and use it. So that worked. Another where one of my bathroom faucets started leaking and I can't get a replacement part because it's part of this whole set that was sold and doesn't sell replacement parts. And so I have to get whole new faucets now and throw out the ones that I have, which are perfectly fine because I can't find a replacement part for it.
Right. That drives me up the wall. And I mean, you and I were talking about this podcast coming out, and we were talking about having a whole one on extended producer responsibility where, like that sink faucet manufacturer has, through regulation, needs to provide that options to its customers. And so I know we're going to talk, extended producer responsibility will probably come up a little bit, but I know it's worth a whole podcast to talk about that. So
Definitely.
yeah. Well, I think there's some things happening in this idea of circularity and what it means to change or shift, because like you said, our culture right now is inexpensive. It's almost like a minimum life cycle. Oh, this is only going to last a couple years. I'll get a new one. And things don't last like they used to. And so I dug into the Global Circularity Foundation. They released a report along with Deloitte that's called the Global Circularity Gap Report. And it kind of gives us an idea about what's happening in business, in the world around this idea of circularity. And although we're talking about it more, like Ellen MacArthur Foundation, you mentioned that one, Eric, there's way more conversations about this topic. But with that said, according to this report, global circularity dropped from 9.1% in 2018 to 7.2% in 2023. So more awareness, but less materials, less opportunity for companies doing this. And so the majority of materials that are being used are virgin. They are not reused. They're the first time use, which is called virgin products. And that secondary materials, they're still declining. And it's a problem because over the past 6 years, the global economy, think about this, the global economy has consumed more than 500 billion tons of materials. And that's the last 6 years, going against and almost equaling up to the entire 20th century. So that's huge. And consumption's continuing to grow. It's at an unsustainable rate. So we really need to think about what can we do. And it really is rethinking how we are doing business now, rethinking what consumers expect, and that they demand more for their money. And so a lot of what we're seeing is businesses are starting to take action. It's a process. And I learned through preparing for this, we've heard and talked about, most people know the term greenwashing. If you're making a sustainability claim, greenwashing is if you're kind of overstating that claim. And there's a new term that's called circular washing. So you're really giving this illusion of sustainability without meaningful impact. I thought that was kind of interesting that there's a term for that now. But what we've seen overall, though, is if we can move to a more circular type of manufacturing process, material extraction can reduce by 33%. And it also puts us in the range of reversing some of that overshoot on planetary boundaries. Now, overshoot, planetary boundaries, what is this? You're talking crazy talk, Christy. And when you hear this in the sustainability world, we kind of know it, but in everyday conversation, maybe we're not talking about overshoot or planetary boundaries. But basically what this means is that we want to make sure that the Earth can support humanity. And if we extract more than the Earth is capable of providing, that is exceeding a planetary boundary. And we are currently overshooting the Earth's capabilities to provide safe life on Earth. And so that's part of why this transition to a circular economy is really important, because it reduces resource extraction and it'll help restore that balance of planetary boundaries and really make sure that humans can live on this planet. Really important part of that. So we wanted to make sure that we really gave you some background on the importance of the circular economy, what's happening. But I don't know about y'all, but I really like real life examples. And so Eric and I are bringing some of those to share with you, to really think about, what is that? How does that apply to my life? And what are some companies that are doing great things? So Eric, I know that you have one of my favorites to share. I'm so excited about
Oh, that's really exciting to hear. Yeah, I ran across this example of a company called Interface. And Interface is a leading producer of carpet and carpet tiles. And one of the things that stood out when I was looking through their information was a quote from their founder, Ray Anderson. And he says, "What's the business case for ending life on Earth?" And this connects directly to what you were just talking about, Christy, which is, if we wind up damaging Earth and life on Earth to the point where economic systems collapse, then where are all these business leaders going to be, or where's all the businesses going to be? They're not going to be in a very good state. And so ultimately, I think there needs to be a recognition, and there's increasingly so, that part of running a successful business is taking into account sustainability, is taking into account your impact on the environment, is taking into account the fact that you are part of the human social network, and the healthier it is, the better it is for your business. So going from that, just wanted to kind of highlight some elements of what Interface has done and is currently doing. And it's a pretty fascinating story. I think in general, they got started back in the 70s, and they introduced this free lay carpet tile product. And just by itself, the idea of carpet tile advanced sustainability efforts by allowing building managers to replace high traffic areas or damaged areas of the carpet without needing to replace the entire carpet on the floor. So that just by itself, is an effort to make, one, save costs, obviously, and reduce the need to replace systems, but it's a sustainable effort just by itself. But beyond that, they've taken it to another level. And in 1994, they initiated their Mission Zero program, which set the target for zero negative impact on the environment by 2020. Well, we're at 2024 now, so I think it's a good time to maybe take a look at how their initiatives played out. But at the time, they identified 7 fronts of sustainability. The first one was eliminating waste. Second one was having benign emissions. The third was renewable energy. Then closing the loop, having resource efficient transportation. Number 6, which is really interesting, is sensitizing stakeholders. And I think this is an important element that maybe gets lost at times, that you're not just operating within a vacuum of your own business, your whole supply chain and all the different stakeholders involved in your business also need to play a part. And there needs to be an element of education, outreach, partnering, and sensitizing your stakeholders in this process. And then finally, redesigning commerce. And so talking about how how the end user, the consumer, is part of this process as well. And so in terms of sort of the outcomes from this initial effort that they started in the mid-90s and targeted 2020 as a time frame, since 1996, Interface has decreased water use at their manufacturing sites by 89%, including using 100% renewable electricity. They've reduced greenhouse gas emission intensity by 96%. They reduced waste to landfill from their global operations by 92%. They've reduced cradle to gate carbon footprint of their carpet by 69%. And they reduced energy used to make products overall by 46%. And so that's an interesting framework. You say 46%, that's not so good. Well, that's incorporating, all of the supply chain and reducing the energy by making their products from cradle to gate is harder than just reducing your energy in your business operations. So that kind of explains that gap there. So a lot of good has come out of this effort. They've really focused on the idea of sustainability and how to reduce their impact on the environment. They've had examples of some failures, and this is part of their discussion, is that, look, this is an iterative process. This is not something that you just initiate one time. You say what you've accomplished, you put it in your sustainability report and say, hey, look, we've accomplished this thing. This is about working through failures. This is about working through different programs and dynamics and recognizing and learning and moving forward. One example of a failure is they introduced a Fair Works initiative that was trying to introduce eco-friendly grass and bamboo woven floor tiles into their product line. They did a lot of successful market testing and had a lot of positive reviews, but ultimately when they rolled it out, it just never really took hold. And so they wound up utilizing that into taking feedback and evolving into new programs and efforts to move in a different direction. And this kind of settles into where they're at now. They've had a lot of success in the last 20 years in terms of getting Mission Zero program on board and improving a lot of their energy and impact on the environment. But they've also recognized that they need to continue and drive this even further. And so their Mission to Zero program has now evolved into a climate take-back mission and a goal to reverse global warming overall in their operations, which is a step further. It's not just about minimizing your impact. It's about reversing negative impacts and actually creating positive impacts from your business. And they've identified 4 key focuses for this. They want to live zero, which pretty much encompasses their Mission Zero program. They want to love carbon, which is basically saying that we want to create carbon sinks and capture carbon and be able to minimize carbon in the atmosphere. They want to let nature cool, basically, trying to reverse global warming. And they want to lead the industrial revolution. And that's an interesting term. And I think one of the areas that this industrial revolution is going, for them at least, is they're wanting to try to examine their building operations and their manufacturing operations and seeing if there's ways to produce a regenerative business model. And so that's starting with the idea of biomimicry and the thought that, can a factory function like a forest? And a well-established forest is a self-sustaining system. It's got soil that feeds the trees. It captures water. It produces rain. All of this system is in place that works in a way that the forest is self-sustaining. And so they're looking into, can we make our factories self-sufficient as well? And this is a challenge, but they've tried it in a couple different models, one in Australia and also in a facility in Georgia. And so some of the areas that they're looking at, which is taking things a step further in terms of trying to understand how your business fits within the environment and how it can be part of a sustainable and a regenerative model. So one thing that they did is looking at water cycling on site, how it assimilates and how it detoxifies, and measuring those rates. Carbon sequestration on sites, and they measure that in tons of carbon per acre per year that is being sequestered at their facilities. They're looking at atmospheric quality and seasonal humidity levels, measuring seasonal humidity levels. They're also looking at soil formation and retention with a focus on how micronutrients are concentrated in the soil surrounding their sites. And finally, habitat and biodiversity is another measure that they're tracking for the regenerative elements, and that's looking at a pollinator abundance index. And so they're really taking this to the next level. They're moving beyond the live zero, the zero waste element, and trying to move beyond that to say, how do we create a system that's self-sustaining, that's regenerative, that's giving back to the planet and helping the planet, versus just trying to minimize the risks and the negative externalities.
That example of biomimicry and thinking about, can a factory function like a forest, is that, nature is solutions. And I really like that example that you shared, because I've heard these ideas, I've heard different examples of how companies incorporate this. Obviously, it's something we all try to do as we design programs and actions and functions. But what you shared, thinking about this as a forest, as an area, a biosphere almost, was really, I like that. That just stood out to me, Eric. I hadn't heard that.
I like it too. And I think one thing that really stood out when I was looking through this was that they're not afraid to set high targets, to really push the boundaries, because it's easy to look at this and be like, come on, like a factory is a forest, like how's that going to work? And ultimately they don't care. They're just like, yeah, we're going to set this target, we're going to build this narrative, we're going to work with as many people as possible to explore how we can push this envelope forward. And that's impressive by itself. And I think it's important. I think they even categorize it as their own moonshot of sorts, and not limiting their ideas to maybe, what's achievable, but not being afraid to fail, as I mentioned before, not being afraid to be transparent about those failures or their successes, and really trying to just, make as much progress as they can and keep their eyes on the higher prize.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you brought this example up, I told you I was excited about it, and I was excited because when I started working in the area of sustainability, it was when I was at Emory University in Atlanta. And because Interfaces, two reasons: because Interfaces in Georgia and the Atlanta area, it's talked about a lot, but it was also it was one of the first companies that was really doing something in this manufacturing space that I recall, right? Not saying they were the first, but it just really stood out to me. It was probably timing in my life and what I was looking for, but it stood out to me. And I think there's a lot of business lessons in this that Ray was practicing in Interface that has paved the way, but yet we also struggle with. And one of those is the thinking about failure. There's no perfect answer in sustainability. I don't believe that there's a perfect answer. And part of that is because technology, innovation, it changes. So what is a perfect answer today might not be the perfect answer in a year or 5 years. And we have to be willing to accept that. And I think part of that is maybe we don't call it failure. Maybe we look at things of saying, I learned something new, and it informed different business decisions, and having the ability for that to be okay. I think that's really important, that customers, employees, boards, the C-suite need to be okay with. And Interface being a private company, they have a little more flexibility in that. But I think that's a really important business lesson in this.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. And as I think what you just mentioned out at the end there is where I was going to, like the private company. It's a lot easier when the founder and leader of a private company puts this as a primary focus. And not to say that that is impossible in publicly traded companies, but it is more difficult. But I think the standard shows that it's possible, and it's possible at a big level. And so the excuses are just those at this point in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. One other point that stood out to me that I think is really important for other businesses to recognize, and one of the points was about decreased water use. And water is not very expensive, generally speaking, across the country. And so some people and organizations might focus on reducing water. It's not a huge business cost. So it's often either, overlooked, or it's not that concerning. And I want to share an example. I had a medium-sized client that literally had built into their budget. They had about $1 million in fines a year that they were receiving because of the water that they were releasing from their factory into the water system had particulates, had materials in it. And so it was increasing the load that they should be submitting into this water pipeline. So basically it was exceeding the threshold that the community would be able to clean and get back out into that community. And so it was $1 million in fines a year that they were literally building into their budget. So water reduction is not just about saving money and reducing costs for just water. There could be other things to think about, whether it is fines or things like that, particularly in manufacturing, when you have that effluent leaving your facility. So I think that's just one point that stands out too, because I think it's important for businesses to see environmental reductions and also know that there's cost impacts as well, one way or the other. Well, I think that I want to share an example too, move on to an example that I want to share with you guys. And this is from IKEA. And, I think pretty much everybody knows an IKEA, has an IKEA way, because every IKEA store is on IKEA way. Nice job branding IKEA. So it's something that generally we know about. It's actually one of the largest retailers in the world. I think it's the third largest retailer in the world. And so most people know about it, but they have a goal of becoming fully circular by 2030. Now that's just around the corner, folks. That's around the corner. So it's right here. And so I think that they're doing it in a couple of different ways that's really interesting. And I'm going to share two examples with you today. So I don't know if you know this, but they do a buyback and resell program. And I'm going to tell you, I didn't know it until I started looking at this. They literally will buy back your furniture. You could go on their website. It's a pretty easy process to do. It's about a 3-step process. And you can get store credit. And I just think that's amazing. So you can use it to buy something else. You can use it to not buy anything else, but it's part of their design. And so I'm going to share an example of that. And one of their number one sellers is called this Billy bookcase. And this Billy bookcase started in 1979. So they've been selling it for decades. And in 1992, they ran into a little bit of a problem. And this problem was that the formaldehyde that was used in the lacquer on this product, these vapors were released into the air. And what happened was they had to stop producing this because it was a contaminant. And it basically cost the company $6 to $7 million. And because they stopped producing these, they had to find another material to replace that lacquer. They moved to a melamine foil. And $6 to $7 million is huge. And that's an environmental concern. So I would just say, hey, companies out there, if you maybe have something that you, one of the products that you're using might have some impacts through volatile organic chemicals, releasing any of that, take a look at your products. Maybe you want to switch it. And so the sales volume for this bookcase, there is one sold every 5 seconds. And that's over 140 million worldwide in 2023. So that's huge. That's a big change in itself. And even in the design, it's kind of interesting. They've designed it just thoughtfully. And they've changed the design since 1979 a couple of times. They've shortened the shelves because, you know, if you've ever had a bookshelf made out of pressed board, it'll start to sag in the center. Well, they didn't want that. They wanted it to last. So they shortened it by 2 inches. They made things modular where you could add some together. So it's just a really interesting approach to design. So I thought that was really one to think about. The other is a mattress recycling program. So if you've ever, I think back to my college days, but if you've ever moved, mattresses are no fun to move. Let's be honest. They're no fun to move. And I've seen, you know, you just drive down through an apartment complex and you'll see mattresses out sometimes because people move in and out. And mattresses oftentimes, and it depends on where you live, but oftentimes aren't accepted into the landfill. And so it's really great to have a program that can take them back and recycle them. So mattresses have about 19 components in them. So that's a lot of pieces and parts that you have to think about. What do you do with this? How do you take this product that's 19 different materials, take it apart? How do you reuse it? And so right now, this isn't a global program. They're testing it in a couple of countries. But so far, they've collected and dismantled 1.5 million mattresses. And they've been able to recover about 85% of those materials overall. And not only recover them, but repurpose them into carpet underlay, insulation, make it into another product that can go back into new mattresses. So it's really an example of how they're thinking about this overall. And when you're doing this, you know, I've mentioned 2 specific items, the bookcase, I've mentioned this mattress, a take back program. Even if you think about this take back program as a singular thing, you have to think about your business as a whole. How are you going to educate your customers about this? How are you going to make it easy for your customers to participate in this program? How do you train your employees to identify if a product is good enough for resale in the as-is department in the stores? And how do you get that back? So that's a whole different way of thinking about business. And so I just think they do a really nice model of that. And it's something, yes, there's other companies that are doing it and thinking about things, but I think these examples that we've shared with Interface and IKEA are really, really solid ones. And one other thing I've got to give a shout out to IKEA about, you know, we think about them in this big store. I think about them in this big store and these products that they sell for your home, but they also have a restaurant. And IKEA was a client of mine on food waste reduction, and they have reduced their food waste by 50%. And that's huge as well. So that's another component that even them thinking about their business, they're thinking about their business in every part of it, not even what they're centrally known for. So I think that's an inspiration that we should think about and use for others.
Yeah, that's really awesome, Christy. I think this is a great example as well. And I think the thing that stands out to me is, you know, that description of shortening the shelves to make sure they don't sag, and the impact of these models is that instead of a company saying, okay, we're going to design it for use once it's out our doors, then it's not our consideration anymore. And so the design, the materials, all of this stuff winds up being different decisions made, because the impact of what happens at the end of their useful life cycle isn't a consideration, and it's an externality in a way. It's not even part of your consideration. Versus if you start incorporating this return model and needing to reincorporate what you're selling back into how you handle it and turn it into something more useful or repurpose or whatever, then that starts impacting the decisions that you're making at the front end, at the design stages, and the selection of material types. And that's really where a lot of this impact really needs to happen, is not on the post-consumer side, like, oh, can you put it in the right bin or not? It's more about really pushing companies to integrate this end-of-life element into their design and initial product rollouts.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we know that this isn't the easiest thing to do, right? There's trial and error. We've talked about some of those. And so you have to really think about, there are some costs and logistics to it. To think about, there's customer adoption. And I think that, going back to the IKEA example specifically, there's some recycling limitations. And part of that even goes back to looking at policy. But, IKEA's recycling rate is 76%. And part of it being 76% is because there's not adequate infrastructure. So they still struggle with infrastructure. And we know every other business is having that same sort of impact, same sort of trouble. But 76% is a stellar recycling rate for what they're doing too. So it can be done. It can be done. And I really hope that this gives some inspiration to folks out there to think about ways they might be able to take some action on it. So I hope these examples that we've shared, and there's so many more out there, but I hope that they've encouraged you to at least think about this a little bit more. I believe if this question didn't cause you pause, I want you to think about it again. What's the business case for ending life on Earth? And sit with that for just a couple minutes and think about it in your business. All right. It's not a good business decision. So what are some ways for you to get started knowing that others have done it? Audit your existing operations, look at what you're doing, understanding where waste occurs, redesign this idea for thinking about circularity. How can you make things modular? How can you make things repairable and reusable? And don't be afraid to pilot. Obviously, you can't change everything. You might have, manufacturing lines. You don't want to change those until you know what works. Partner, look at some partners, run some pilot programs, and then use that information to make your decisions. And this is not anything that can be done in a vacuum. You need people involved in this process. You have to involve your C-suite leaders. You have to think about your design team, supply chain, logistics, and your customers. Your ecosystem, your stakeholder ecosystem needs to be involved in how you're thinking about this. They're going to bring ideas. They're going to challenge ideas. And that's where innovation can happen. And it can have positive impacts on the environment, the people, and your financial impact as well.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. And I think, a couple key lessons that I heard in this discussion was the idea of iteration and scaling. Start with pilot projects, expand based on the insights that you gain. Don't be afraid to fail, because that's going to inform your next project and make it better and more impactful. And then I think the other one is embedding the culture change in your organization throughout. Promote circularity internally through incentives and education. Make it part of your daily interactions and your company culture. It's really important.
And if you're thinking about what is the future for this, the World Economic Forum says there is positive momentum here. Circular practices are expected to accelerate. So this is an opportunity for you, if you're listening to this, to think about how you can get ahead of tighter environmental regulations and public pressure. Be on the forefront of this. And then, of course, what Eric said, scale up. Do these pilot programs and think about how you can get better at this, how it can make your business better. And where there's opportunities for stronger policy frameworks that helps you with your collaboration. But you can do this. I hope we've inspired you to make sure that you know you can do this. And if you have a favorite brand that you love, but maybe they're not doing this, give them a nudge. Businesses really respond to their customers, especially their loyal customers. So make sure you're asking and requesting this as a consumer.
Yeah, and I think point to end on is just take a step, move forward, push people, identify that this is not changing in a direction going back to the 1950s necessarily. This is about going forward and making a new world that's regenerative, that recognizes that business, communities, people, nature, animals, plants, all are part of the same thing, and we need to move forward and make a better world for ourselves. So let's go do it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Going Zero. Keep up with the latest in sustainability by subscribing to our newsletter at goingzero.org or on LinkedIn. To learn more about going tree-free and plastic-free in your workspace, visit our sponsor at emeraldecovations.com.